and thank you for coming out this evening. My name is Kyle Cleveland. I'm with TUJ's Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies. It's great to see this larger turnout. This is one of our, I think, our larger turnouts. And we'd like to ask, if you've not done so already, to please leave your mail sheet there at the front so that you can get on our mailing list. I personally have been looking forward to this event for quite a long time because I think it's a very important topic, and David and Lucy are kind of uniquely positioned to be able to say something about this because they were working up in Tohoku and Fukushima early on, and I think they have a unique perspective about this. This recently published book, Strong in the Rain, is going to be on sale this evening. It's for 3,000 yen. It's over there on the side if you'd like. And this evening, our guests will be giving a lecture or talking back and forth for maybe 30 or 40 minutes, and I hope to have an extended Q&A. Lucy Burmington is a longtime Tokyo-based journalist. She's written for Time Magazine, Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, Bloomberg. She worked for NHK for about a dozen years and has published several books, including Strong in the Rain and also Old Kyoto, a guide to shops, inns, and restaurants. David McNeil writes for The Economist, The London Independent, and is the Asia correspondent for the Chronicle of Higher Education. He holds a doctorate in sociology, has taught at a number of universities in Ireland, the UK, and China, currently teaches media and politics at Sophia University. So let's welcome our guest.
Thank you so much for coming. This is a great turnout. What I'd like to start with first is we're going to do a show of hands. First question is, how many people here in this room were here on March 11th at the disaster, on the day of the disaster? Oh, wow, okay. Majority. Okay. The next question is, how many left because they were worried because of the radiation? Okay, interesting. How many of you now are still worried about the radiation? Okay, very interesting. I'm going to put that information aside for a minute. Basically, what we're going to do is explain how the book came about. I'm just going to give a little introduction about that. I was approached by a literary agency in New York City who they had read my story in Time and asked me if I was interested in writing a book. And never having written a book like this before, I sort of said, okay, well, let me get back to you. And consulted with some friends, and they said, come on, don't be an idiot, you have to say yes right now. So fortunately I did. And for me, it turned out to be a real gift, this whole thing. How it all came together was incredibly synchronistic. And I felt very privileged to be able to write about this whole topic in a book form. I approached David for many reasons. We had worked together at NHK. He's a brilliant journalist. I think he's a brilliant journalist. And his strengths and my strengths balanced out really nicely. He is a nuclear expert and had done already extensive, he'd been up to the Fukushima plant many times, and I hadn't been able to do that yet. And our writing styles are actually quite similar, so that's probably one of the reasons why the book flows as well as it does. One of the biggest issues that we faced, as I'm sure a lot of journalists know, is the whole deadline situation. And we were told we had to get it written in 4 months. So it was a huge challenge to do that, and extremely exhausting. It was reporting and writing at the same time, going up and down to Tohoku very many times. Initially, we wrote a proposal, and then fortunately, Palgrave Macmillan raised their hand and said, okay, we are interested. So we ended up being able to get the whole thing out in about 6 months. And the book came out in the States in October, and in November it came out basically the rest of the world. So, do you want to talk about why we wrote the book?
Sure.
Well, I think we're both going to have to stand up.
Well, why we wrote the book, I suppose, really, the book came about, as Lucy said, because she was approached by a publisher. But in my particular case, you know, I'd already done a lot of reporting. I'd been up and down from Tohoku 9 or 10 times. I'd actually been inside the power plant once as well, which explains the hairstyle. I always make that joke, sorry. But you know, so we kept meeting these sort of remarkable people, you know, who had these amazing stories. And the stories were inflected with the sort of Tohoku culture, if you like. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but they were very reticent about telling their stories. They didn't really want to be seen to grandstand. You know, I don't know if that's a Japanese quality, but I've heard many people say since that it's actually a Tohoku quality. You know, that you couldn't get people to tell their stories, but when they did, they were so compelling and remarkable, and there were a number of things which kept coming up again and again. And one of them, the most striking to me, was the way that they sort of put duty, work, and duty to their to where they worked over other things, over their family, over their own personal distress in many cases. So, you know, only the most striking example of that is our nuclear power plant worker who, you know, went through this very traumatic experience of being in the power plant when the nuclear disaster happened, and then managing to escape, and then going back. You know, I mean, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't go back, and not for very much money. I mean, he was paid about 200,000 yen a month to do that job, and he got a small bonus of 1,000 yen. He called it bento money, 1,000 yen a day to go and do that job, and he's still paid that amount of money, you know, and he's still with the same subcontractor. So I found that kind of remarkable. You know, these people would put an employer that hadn't particularly treated them very well, and certainly wasn't paying them very well, over their own personal safety, and in some cases over their own families. So as we say in the book, Mayor Sakurai, for example, didn't look for his parents. You know, he didn't know if his parents were alive or dead. This is the mayor of Minamisoma. For the entire duration of the worst parts of the crisis, you know, he kind of put it to one side. And again, for me, I don't know about what you think, but for me, I would need to know, first of all, about the safety of my family before I could go on and carry on every day and do this job. So as I said, we met people like that. We kept meeting them during the course of reporting for, in my case, for The Independent and for the Irish Times. And then I thought, well, wouldn't it be amazing, wouldn't it be remarkable to be able to tell their story in more detail, you know, and through that sort of thinking and through the offer of the book came the idea of telling the story through their eyes, and we had to pick 6 people. I mean, we actually thought we would choose more people. Initially we thought 8 or 9 or something like that, and we were just talking about some of the sort of remarkable people we had to leave out. One of which, well, I should probably mention this, the Chinese worker. Yeah. So we had, I don't know if you remember the incident, I think it was in Onagawa, where there were Chinese workers in a fish processing factory, who were rescued by their boss, Japanese boss, and then the boss died. And he, you know, became this sort of story about cross-cultural bonds. It's all being forgotten about now because of the Senkaku stuff, of course. But it did become a very sort of emblematic disaster, a story of the disaster about this, you know, this Japanese boss saving these poor Chinese workers. And we did actually want to write about the Chinese worker, one Chinese worker in the book, and the publisher, yeah, I'll go ahead with this. The publisher said, well, no, don't worry about that because nobody's interested in China. And that was the kind of decisions that we had to make, you know, and we were very reluctantly sort of didn't write about that worker. And another person was a photographer in Ofanato who had the entire, or a large collection of the town's photographs in her studio when the tsunami came and washed everything away. And we thought her story as well was kind of really amazing, you know, that she had the entire sort of archive, if you like, of the town, and it was washed away, and how she tried to save those photographs. So those are the kind of the reasons why we said we would be able to write a good book.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and introduce our 6 characters, the people who we did write about. I'll introduce my 3 characters. This is David Trummerlund, and we decided that we really wanted to have a foreigner, at least one among the six. And I discovered David because he had been interviewed on 60 Minutes. And it just was incredible how this all came together. The literary agent's husband had been here in Japan interviewing him, and said, well, why don't you go ahead and try to contact him. He was actually hiding from the press and did not want to be interviewed. He's a very shy, very private person, and also a very serious Christian. And I was really reluctant to contact him, but did. And finally he agreed and sort of said, okay, all right, you can interview me. So it wasn't easy at first to interview him, but then finally, and I found with all the other people that we interviewed, it was really hard for them to relive the moments that they experienced during the tsunami. And David's story was absolutely incredible. The water, so this is in the gymnasium at the elementary school where he was teaching that Friday. And the water went all the way up to the clock. And he was with, it was an elementary school, so there were about 200 or 300 kids there, parents, children, and a nursing home right nearby. So there were a lot of old, elderly people and some people in wheelchairs. So he ended up saving students and parents and babies and the whole thing, and just had this absolutely remarkable story to convey, but was very, very humble about it and actually didn't really want to talk about it much. The next character is, this is Toru Saito. We also wanted to get somebody who was quite young. He was 18 at the time, had just graduated high school, and was looking forward to going to Tohoku University. And he, oh, I'm sorry, I should have talked about David. He was living in Higashi Matsushima. Toru is from Oginohama, which is just north of Ishinomaki on the Oshika Peninsula. It's a very beautiful, it was a very beautiful village area. Fishing, obviously, oysters is the main industry there. And he lost everything. This is the land where his home was. And the entire village, all the villages around that whole area were completely destroyed. And they ended up having to go to an evacuation center, which was his primary school. Here it is. And living there for about 4 months. And he was very worried that he wouldn't be able to go to Tohoku University because obviously they had completely lost everything. But fortunately, the university waived the entrance fees and I think it was probably the whole first year tuition and partially tuition going forward. So that was very, very fortunate. Then my third character was Setsuko Uwabe, and she is in Rikuzen Takata. She was a cook for a nursery school. And on the day of the quake, tsunami, they had about 300 babies and children there. And the amazing thing about this, and also the same with Toru, this is about a mile from the ocean. And they heard the tsunami warning, but couldn't believe that a tsunami would reach this far. And she's the one who actually spotted smoke in the distance and said, oh my God, it's a tsunami coming. So they all had to gather these little children. Fortunately, parents had been coming and were picking up some of their kids, and then just ran with kids. And one of the main reasons why we chose her is because she lost her husband, and we wanted to convey that whole incredible emotional experience and the tradition of that, of death, basically, in Japan, and how the Japanese handle that. So, do you want to?
Well, do you want to go first? Yeah, sure.
Okay. I guess now that you've met my three characters, I'm going to read a passage from the book really quickly. Kind of hard to stand up. Okay. It was the evening of Sunday, March 13th, when Setsuko heard the news of Takuya. Takuya is her husband. His body had been found near a river, not far from their home. For Setsuko, it seemed as if he had been trying to find a way back to her and their family. The next morning, it took all of her strength to go to the elementary school where his body was being held in the makeshift morgue. She was sure it would be mutilated in some way, or barely recognizable. At least his body was found, she thought. So many are still missing. Fortunately, she was not alone. Her sister-in-law and a neighbor had agreed to go with her and keep her company. As she stepped into the gym, the sight astounded her. Corpses wrapped in large bags filled the floor. A policeman brought her to Takuya's body. Lying next to him was one of his closest friends. The two had been buddies since childhood. Setsuko marveled at the coincidence. Even here, you're still together, she thought. As the policeman carefully opened Takuya's bag, she could still see that he was wearing his work ID tag, which had made it easy to identify him. With fear and hesitation, she then looked into his face, but was amazed at what she saw. He looked so serene, so beautiful, she thought, as she touched his smooth cheeks and closed eyelids. There were no gashes or marks. His neatly brushed black hair was thinning, the only sign of his 58 years. Although his clothes were muddied, his body was not bloated or disfigured. He still looked like the husband she had always known. It was almost as if he was taking a quick nap and would awaken at any moment. Even his watch that he wore every day was still ticking. Tears spilled from her eyes, and she felt the weight of despair meld into relief. He had come back to her and the family after his treacherous tsunami journey and was now finally safe out of harm's way.
So I'll just introduce my characters. That's one of what we tried to do is include a few photographs that we took ourselves. This is Ikeda-san. Ikeda-san is a fisherman, and we felt that we had to have a fisherman for obvious reasons. You know, Japan is so synonymous with the sea, and the fishermen, of course, around Tohoku were not only hit by the tsunami, but also by the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And in fact, they're still suffering. You know, the last time I checked, only 2% of them have, around the Tohoku coast, Fukushima coast, only 2% of them have returned to work because the radiation is still considered too high to allow them to fish. So I mean, there were lots of, you know, again, Ikeda-san was so reticent about explaining his story, you know, and so difficult to persuade. And he was the only one I had to look for. Most of the other two people we met I met them during the course of reporting. In his case, I had to go and search for him because we agreed we needed a fisherman. And he said, I'll tell you this story once, but I never want to say it again. His boss, Abe-san, who also had an incredible story, and Abe-san's story is especially unique because you can see it on YouTube. I think I say in the book, and I might actually give the link to the YouTube clip where you can see Abe-san on the top of the Soma fishing co-op clinging to a skylight as the tsunami washes around him. You know, he barely survived. But he said the same thing. He said, I'll tell this to you once, and then I'm never going to tell it to you again. And as I said, on Wednesday, I made the mistake. The BBC camera crew was over here last year, and they were making a documentary about the Fukushima disaster called Meltdown, a very good documentary. And I was a consultant on that. And they said, do you know a fisherman? And I said, yeah, Abe-san, you know. And I actually sent them to Abe-san, and he was very angry. He called me up and said, why did you tell BBC that I would talk to them, you know? I told you I don't want to tell this story again. So he wasn't pretending. He really only wanted to say this story once. And as an Irishman, you know, we love telling stories, and our stories always get better every time we tell them. It was just really hard for me to understand that. But that was just a cultural thing. We meant that over and over again. So, you know, his story was remarkable in many ways, but the thing that I suppose was most remarkable to me was, or most counterintuitive, was how he, when he felt the earthquake, he was in his bath, and then he rushed to the coast to try and get his boat, and gunned his boat into the sea, into the tsunami. So it was so striking. You know, everybody else was running away from the tsunami, but he was actually, and all the fishermen indeed, were going in the opposite direction, because if they can beat the tsunami to the coast, then they can save their boats. And he was able to save his boat, but about 100 out of roughly 1,000 of the fishermen in that area weren't so lucky. So this this man, I suppose, probably a lot of people in the room know by now. He is the mayor, of course, of Minami Soma City, which is about 12 miles, I think, north of the Fukushima Daini power plant. And he's famous for, of course, making this YouTube video appealing directly to the world for help, because he felt, well, first of all, of course, his town was completely decimated by the nuclear disaster. The town before the disaster, the population was about 71,000. And when people, and I'll read an extract from the book, but when the citizens of the town began to fear the contamination from the nuclear power plant, they all left. And the only people who were left at the worst of the disaster was just about 10,000 people left in the town. And they were usually old people or the sick or the infirm. And there was no supplies coming to the town at all. No petrol or gasoline, as you say in America. No, the convenience stores were all closed. There was no food coming through. The media, sort of, and we can talk about this later on, but the media had abandoned the town. All of the reporters of the big newspapers had pulled out on March the 12th, and they didn't return for 40 days. And so there was nobody there really to report what was going on. And it was the biggest city, in the closest large city, I should say, to the nuclear disaster. So it was a very, very serious decision for reporters to sort of pull out like that. So in desperation, he made this very famous YouTube video appealing to people, saying his town was melting down, people were dying, and so on. And as a result, the foreign reporters, of course, all piled up to interview him, and quite a few freelance Japanese reporters as well. That's how we got to know him. And you know, I mean, I don't want to spend too much time on one person, but I find him a very compelling man, because you know, he first of all, he went through this enormous tragedy. He somehow came through it unscathed, and now he's trying to bring his town back from the brink, and still the town is still, you know, very, very scarred. They've lost permanently perhaps a third of the population of the town. The taxes have fallen for obvious reasons. Still large parts of the town are contaminated, and he believes that Japan really lost a chance to change 2 years ago. He believes that Japan had a chance to really use that disaster and take a different direction, and he's quite disappointed by what's happened since. And this is not a still from a porno movie. This is the nuclear power plant worker. We had to pixelate him because, of course, he spoke to us anonymously. He still works for the same company, as I said, for a subcontractor to TEPCO. Actually, it's a subcontractor of a subcontractor, I think, to be perfectly accurate. And again, you know, such a compelling story. Not just because he went back to the power plant, but because he keeps going back. And when we talked last time, he said that he doesn't know if he'll ever get married, because he said he would have to tell whoever he was going to marry that he had worked at this power plant and had absorbed all this radiation. And in fact, he stopped working at the Daini power plant about a year ago, because he had exceeded the level of radiation which he was supposed to. They have limits. And he subsequently went to work at J Village, and now he's doing decontamination around the power plant. So he said, I would have to tell somebody if I was going to get married. He's a young man, he's only 28, 29, that I have absorbed all this radiation, and I don't know if any woman would marry me because of that, and I have to sort of face that reality, and how remarkable, it is that he keeps doing this job despite what happened to him. Right, we stuck this photograph in because I'm so proud of it. No, it was just I visited the power plant at the end of March. Not visited actually, just drove up to the main gates. This is when you could still drive inside the exclusion zone around the power plant. If you recall, the government made it illegal to go into the power plant around about April, I think it was. It could have even been a bit later. But at the time when I took this photograph, and this is of the visitor centre outside of the Daini power plant, and I thought it was quite striking because there's a crack right through the sign and the visitor centre. And of course, one of the big debates raised by the disaster, and which to my mind hasn't really been settled, is exactly how much damage the earthquake did to the reactors, particularly reactor 1 in the Daiichi power plant. And you know, there's been a number of commission reports and so on. One of them, the big Diet Commission report, sort of hedged its bets on that and said, well, we can't rule out that the earthquake did the damage, not the tsunami, to reactor number 1. And if that's the case, then there's enormous implications, of course, for all of the power plants in Japan and the possible damage from nuclear, from an earthquake. And that's the same photograph. I don't know what he's saying, but it's not very pleasant. Getaway, something like that. And finally then, if you, actually I was talking to Peter Blakely, me and Peter went up several times to photograph around Itatemura, places like that. And if you go up there now, you'll still see these bags of nuclear, well, they're basically bags of earth, of course, but contaminated earth sitting in piles up there. And the big, dilemma, I suppose, is how to get rid of them. What do you do to them? Most people I spoke to up there said they're just going to stay in the bags of contaminated earth. They're just going to stay up there because nobody will take them. Well, that kind of speaks for itself, doesn't it? I mean, you know, we I suppose the big fallout, if that's the right word, social fallout from the disaster is the rebirth of social protest, of what people would associate with the 60s and the 70s in Japan. Street protests, you know, young people getting angry, standing outside of the Kantei, the Prime Minister's office. A lot of older people too, yeah. I was thinking of, there's two, in my mind I divide the protests into two, maybe wrongly, but there's the Kantei protests, which seem to me to be quite young and angry, and they're probably faded now. And then the big demonstrations, of course, climaxing last July with the Yoyogi Koen, demonstration, which of course was old. And I was actually thinking, 3 of the people on the stage, the average age was about 75, right? Because it was Kanzagoro away, and some of them were actually in their 80s. There were 60 generation who led the behavior.
That's yours, Lisa.
Well, that speaks for itself as well.
Yeah.
I'm going to sit down and read this passage if that's okay, because I'm not sure I can hold the book and the mic at the same time. So this is, if anybody has the book, this is page 69. The story here is that this is in Minami Soma. This is, of course, as I said, the emblematic nuclear town in the nuclear disaster. And for 2 days, the government spokesperson, Edano-san, has been on TV, basically saying everything's okay, you know, relax. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but, you know, don't worry, the situation's under control. And we quote him saying things like that. And then there's an explosion, of course, in the number 1 reactor on March the 12th. And he comes on TV again, and he says more or less the same thing. And this is where we pick up in Minami Soma. The citizens of Minami Soma, on the border of the exclusion zone, did not believe Edano. Once they saw the explosion on TV, they immediately began to leave. The exodus started on March the 12th and turned into a flood by March 15th, creating a traffic jam outside the city government building. Cars inched by the mayor's office, the faces of children pressed up against steamed-up windows. Day after day, hundreds of people crowded the reception area below Sakurai's office, demanding information and help. Men cornered the mayor when they saw him walking through the first floor. "What the hell are you doing?" some shouted. "Tell us what's going on, you asshole." He knew little more than his accusers. There was no communication from the government or TEPCO. Calls went unanswered. It was a week before anyone from the central government arrived, and 22 days before TEPCO finally told Minamisoma about the drama unfolding at the power plant a dozen or so miles away. Gasoline was the most common demand as people started to flee, but it had to be rationed because after the first reactor explosion, delivery trucks began to stay away. City officials were sent to man pumps at the local gasoline stand. The day after the first explosion, a tanker driver called from Koriyama, about 32 miles away, and said he was not going any further because he was terrified of the radiation. Sakurai's staff had to go themselves to get the truck full of vital fuel. It was among the first ominous signs that deliveries to the city would soon stop coming. Food trucks and other utilities also ceased. An exodus of city and medical workers from the city's biggest hospital began. How were they to cope with the sick and the old? Who would retrieve the bodies still scattered around the city's coastal communities? On March the 14th, journalists from Japan's big daily newspapers and TV companies covering Minamisoma suddenly disappeared, meaning that on-the-ground news from the most vulnerable large city in a nuclear crisis would vanish for weeks. They would not return for over a month. Some of the city workers had started to peel off too. My city was melting down, Sakurai says. In the middle of the chaos came the worst task of all. The exhausted mayor had to visit the makeshift morgue in the local agricultural college. The bloated bodies of men he had farmed with, friends of his family for years, were laid out on the ground. There were just no words for what I felt, he recalls. But there could be no question of deserting his post, or even going to look for his parents. Duty to the citizens who had elected him came first. Only later would he find out their fate. At night, he would curl up for a few hours in a room behind his office, wrapped in a blanket. Before dawn, his eyes would open and he would wonder what horrors the next day would bring. Thank you.
So, do you want to just do Q&A?
Yeah, we've probably talked for enough. I mean, that's over half an hour, so let's throw it out. I'm sure there's a lot of questions and comments. And I'm doing my own MC here. Sorry, taking somebody to roll over.
Could you please wait for the mic? And I know some of you think you don't need a mic, but we need for you to use a mic. So if you could please raise your hand so that we can pass it to you. Sure.
So anybody have a question?
Hello. I've got a question about the response in Tokyo and around here in terms of disaster response by people providing accommodation or homestay to people who they saw on television as being in trouble in these areas that were affected by the earthquake. I'm particularly interested because I actually applied for a homestay to people who maybe were suffering, and I noticed there were about 3,000 other Tokyos who had offered their houses to people. But we never actually heard anything at all, as far as I know. We never heard from the company after an initial, or from the organisation involved, after an initial kind of thank you for having contacted them. Do you know anything about that side of the story at all?
Not really. I know that many of the refugees stayed at hotels in Tokyo, but that was extremely generous of you to do that. In fact, you're the first person I've heard who has actually done that.
I think there were 3,000 or 4,000 people who had applied to offer their homes. I'm sure it's a very, I'm sure it's not an unusual story at all, because lots of people obviously were donating money at that time. There was, I mean, it was such a huge news story. But I actually feel like that part of the story, the response that actually occurred on a wider level within the population in Tokyo is very unknown. I mean, I know nothing about it. I just know that we have never heard anything after having filled in.
Just as you're talking, I'm recalling somebody called Tom Gill. I don't know if anybody knows Tom Gill. He's a professor at Meiji Gakuin, I think. He contacted me sometime in March and said he was opening his home to refugees, and he had contacted all of the local governments. He contacted Tokyo first of all, and then he phoned directly to Fukushima City, and he'd gone that way through the bureaucratic kind of route, and he got nowhere. And the reason why he was contacting me was because he thought it was a story. He was saying, why don't you write about how bureaucracies are stopping people from doing the good thing, or the decent thing? And I never did, but now that's the first time I've thought about that story since in nearly 2 years. And I suspect that's probably what it was. It was, ordinary people's instincts, good instincts, being trampled by bureaucracy or by paperwork or something like that. I think a lot of people did put people up, but it wasn't made easy for them. That's what I suspect.
Well, the only reason I'm particularly interested is that obviously that somebody was facilitating this idea. It was not our idea. It was an idea that we tapped into. But my mother-in-law, who lives with us, is Japanese, and she said at the time, she said, well, obviously it would be very hard for people to come down and leave their communities because they would feel like they were betraying, and they may not ever be able to go back there because they would actually be, in some sense, betraying their local communities who expected them to stay there. I wonder what kind of peer pressure there was to stop that kind of flood of people, but do you know anything about that?
Yeah, there was, I think, huge peer pressure among many families, grandparents, multi-generation families living together. Grandparents were saying, don't go, don't go. There was a lot of infighting in families. Most of the people that I know, that I met, stayed. And they felt that they really wanted to stay with their community. And the whole community issue was huge. And that is still one of the biggest issues now facing a lot of people from that area, is that their communities have been destroyed. And community is kind of the heart of the Tohoku people. Anybody else? Hi.
You mentioned the mayor of Yamisama, was it? Who was expecting some changes in Japan, and he was disappointed. Can you tell us something about the changes that he hoped for, and whether they were reasonable, and what's really the situation with that kind of expectation?
Well, I think the main change that he wanted, although not the only one, was Japan to abandon nuclear power. He thinks that I don't think he was an anti-nuclear zealot before all this kicked off, although he was on the left. I think he was JCP, but don't quote me on that. And he thought that a disaster like this was an opportunity for Japan to really rethink its energy policies and to scrap its nuclear power plants and to think about alternatives. And that's really his mission. He's thought a lot about making Minamisoma a center for alternative energy research, and he's got all these plans, one of which is to create a university up there. And as I was telling Henry today, there's been some success. I mean, Toshiba, for example, says it's going to open one of the biggest solar power facilities in Japan on the ruined coast of Minamisoma, where they haven't rebuilt yet. But obviously, for him, those plans have not moved fast enough. And he gave that interview, well, he talked to me last November, and he gave an interview at the Mainichi, and actually came to the Foreign Correspondents Club, I think, late November or December. And he said more or less the same things, and that was before the election of the LDP. And of course, the election of the LDP has, if you like, hardened the pro-nuclear cause. You know, I mean, they haven't really made that much of a secret of their desire to restart those nuclear power plants, even if they'll have, we don't know if they'll have some success. So I think he could see the way things were going. He was also very disappointed with just the speed of reconstruction. You know, he felt that this was a chance to drive a truck through Japan's bureaucracy. You know, to really sort of make a system or start a system that would put people first, to paraphrase the name of a political party, actually. But he thought that, you know, he thought that the system wasn't responsive enough to popular signals, and that because the shock from this disaster would have made the bureaucracy more responsive, more open, and maybe would have swept the bureaucracy away. And of course that hasn't happened either, you know. So I think those two things would be the main things where he's got problems.
I was wondering if there were any major differences between how the disaster and its aftermath were reported in the Western media and in the Japanese media.
Started.
Uh-oh.
Where do we begin?
This could be a long answer.
We
Well,
were talking about how we could write a whole book on this. So.
yeah. Well, I mean, we actually wrote a chapter about it, and the chapter is essentially about that. You know, it's about the difference in the way the media covered it. I was really, really trying hard not to say them versus us. You know. And I don't think actually them meaning, you know, the Japanese, and us meaning the foreign reporters. And I think that's a very simple way of looking at it, and it's not accurate. Because I see it as a structural problem. I see there was structural differences in the way that the Japanese big media reported the disaster, typified by the episode I mentioned around Minamisoma, which is all of the reporters pulled out en masse like a retreating army, you know, which was very striking, very not just striking to me, but very striking to Mayor Sakurai. And then the second incident was when you went up to the zone around the nuclear power plant. This was in March and April, when it was still not illegal to go inside the zone. And when it was the biggest story in the world. I mean, everybody was trying to find out what was happening inside that zone. You know, are there feral animals there? Are there people left behind? What's life like? And so a couple of us went up, you know, foolishly, and wrote about it. And they tended to be foreign reporters, although not always. I mean, there's a member of the club, Teddy Jimbo, for example, who was a freelancer who went up with a camera, and you can see his report on YouTube. But it was just really striking how there were no, you know, reporters from the big Japanese newspapers and TV companies there. That was so striking. You couldn't see them, you couldn't find their reports. And when they went back in, they tended to go in with official visits. So, you know, the police went in their masks and all their paraphernalia, and the reporters went with them. And I was so puzzled by this, you know, I went and talked to quite a lot of I talked to about 5 or 6 reporters, and most of them are quoted. And they said things like, well, it was very dangerous. Which it was, but, you know, it was dangerous to everybody. And there was the danger of it, for us at least, or for me, let's just keep it personal, was overcome by the possibility of a scoop. You know, and that's certainly the way that a lot of Western reporters think about. I've got to go in and get a scoop, right? And because of the way reporting is done in the big media organizations in Japan, there was less incentive to go in and do that. There was less incentive for a scoop. And the other thing which we heard was, well, all of us, the reporters, the Japanese reporters, were told to leave. They were just told by their head organization. And you know, that lends itself to a conspiracy, right? They were told by who? You know, was it the government, right? And I don't know. I don't think it was. You know, I don't think that's the way things work. I think it was probably a mix of things. One of them was, what if one of reporters goes in and gets cancer in 10 years' time, and then he's going to sue us? You know, it's going to be a big shitstorm. So why don't we just ban them from going in there? And the reporters in the big media organizations, as we said in the book, collectively agree not to cover certain things. It's like a cartel agreement. So nobody can outscoop somebody else. So that's the Japanese side, right? But you know, again, you could talk a long time about the failures of the Western reporters as well. I mean, there's an awful lot of exaggeration, an awful lot of bad reporting. Now, I tend to blame, yeah, those on the wall of shame, there's a wall of shame which you can look at, which some people probably have. I was in there actually for saying the emperor had left Tokyo, by quoting somebody who said that. But there was a lot of exaggerated reporting, mainly by journalists who'd been parachuted into Japan from abroad, who didn't know the place very well, who didn't know how to negotiate the bureaucracy, who didn't know where to go for press conferences, and they tended to speculate in the vacuum that was left by the lack of information. There was an awful lot of that going on. And there was a couple of famous cases. One was Fox TV. I love picking on Fox TV. Fox TV putting a nuclear power plant in Shibuya. Do you remember that one? Yeah. That was my favorite. But there were others, you know, there were lots. I mean, you know, one newspaper back home in Ireland, I think it was the Donegal Herald or something like that. Somebody's going to correct me here. And it was the Donegal something, which is, the Donegal is like totally isolated, extreme western part of Ireland, you know. And the headline in the Donegal Herald was "Radiation plume from Fukushima arrives in Donegal," you know. So there was lots of bad reporting on both sides.
Add a little bit about the Kahoku Shinbo, which is a major newspaper in the Sendai area and the Tohoku area. And I was able to interview some of the managing editors there and ask them about this question exactly, why did you all leave? And he said, we didn't all leave. And it was very interesting to hear because they're locals. They live there. They're connected with the people. And they felt very, very frustrated about not being able to cover a lot of these stories because of the radiation situation. And apparently some of the senior editors did stay in Fukushima and some of the dangerous areas, but like I spoke with one woman reporter, and she said she was told to leave right away. And it was a big debate. In fact, they really wanted to come back in, a lot of them. It was a whole guilt thing, you know how Japanese can feel very guilty in this kind of situation where they feel they're not part of the team. Yeah, it was over a month. It was about 2 months, almost maybe more than 2 months before most of them came back in the irradiated area. But there was a huge debate about it for sure.
So I have a question concerning one of the pictures you showed us where the radioactive earth is collected in those black bags. I stumbled upon an article which claimed that basically these bags are, the earth is being shoveled together by a Japanese company, and they do not do anything about really like cleaning it, even though the technology would exist. So it seems that foreign companies had offered their assistance to get this earth cleaned, to remove the radioactivity. However, this tax money which is being used to do these operations is being given to such a company, and in Japan just putting it into bags and leaving it to stay there forever, as opposed to inviting foreign companies to assist in the efforts and getting it cleaned properly. Now I was wondering if you have some background information on this.
Not really. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I'm just not very technical. I don't know how you would decontaminate Earth. You know, I just know what I heard up there, which is that the plan is that the plan over the whole area is to scrape 5 centimeters of Earth off wherever they find contamination. So if you think about schoolyards, you know, that's reasonably straightforward, right? Because schoolyards are flat. And you can just, you know, remove the earth quite simply, and that's why schools, like there's a school in Minamisoma on the road to the power plant, which has reopened. It reopened about 6 months afterwards, and it's got a dosimeter outside permanently reading what the radiation is. And as somebody pointed out to me when I wrote about this, they said, well, the radiation at the time was less than it is in many large Western cities, so the radiation they can say is low, but of course the students haven't returned. But then you talk to farmers, And they say, well, how do you scrape 5 centimeters off a farm? You know, I mean, a farm is like this, right? And anyway, the radiation has sunk really deep into the ground. And then there's the radiation in the forests, which is going to wash down again anyway, you know. So, and there's a lot of, you know, concern about radiation, some of which probably isn't that warranted, you know, in the sense that maybe it's not that dangerous, but at the same time, people are not going to take it. And as well, people debate all that stuff. What exactly are they going to do? How safe is it to live in this place? You know, whenever I hear somebody saying it's perfectly safe, as they do in debates all the time, and I always say to them, well, would you bring your kid up there? You know, if you had a child, would you go and live up there? And most people would say no, they wouldn't take the risk. So while that debate is all going on, this earth is just sitting there, you know, and I don't think it's going to move. I can't see how it would. And I didn't know actually you could decontaminate it. I've never heard that before.
I don't really have a question, but I wanted to comment on that issue, basically. The main reason it's not being done is it's too expensive. Just cleaning the area is a phenomenal cost. It's being done now almost superficially, in my opinion. I'm not an expert, but I've been documenting it for the last 2 years, almost, year and a half. And early on, there were people actually going to farmers and testing whether they could decontaminate it, but then of course they can, there is the technology. But in order to decontaminate one rice field would probably cost more than the rice it would produce for the next 50 years. I mean, I'm assuming that because it's just phenomenally expensive. You go now and you see them scraping the earth off of rice fields in Itate Mura, for example, and they have maybe 200 or 300 people. They have half a dozen graders scraping the soil. They have people mowing it with weed. I was in Nagatoro, which is a very contaminated zone in Itate Mura, outside the 20-kilometer zone. And they're using weed whackers to cut down the straw that's left over from the rice harvest, or the rice that didn't grow, or the weeds that grew. And they're bagging those. And then they walk two kilometers away or a kilometer away and have lunch, and then they go back and they do the same thing. The area is now closed off. It's not accessible unless you're a resident. But it's, you know, if you can imagine them doing that, just in the areas that were inside the 20-kilometer zone, and then you can imagine it, you know, in the 50-kilometer zone where the plume went to the northwest. And then you imagine all the cities of Fukushima and Kuriyama, which have high enough levels that they've had to decontaminate the schools, and there's no place to put it. And there's really no technology beyond washing it that's affordable. I mean, you can decontaminate a classroom or a building, but you're talking about, what's the size of Fukushima?
The Fukushima can?
Well, it's Fukushima, well, I mean, the contaminated area of Fukushima, which is basically the entire prefecture, but comparatively, what size of?
About half of Massachusetts.
Half of Massachusetts. Okay. Scraping the soil off half of Massachusetts. Anyway, I said my piece.
Hi, my name is Seigo Izumo. I'm a physician, and I volunteered at the Minamisoma Evacuation Center in the first week of April. At that time, as you mentioned, the residents are allowed to go back to their homes during the daytime. And I was there for 1 week as a physician, and my dosimeter read 250 chest X-ray equivalent in 1 week. But strangely, on the newspaper or prefecture department, reading is way low. It's like a 1/100th of what my dosimeter is recording. And I think what happened at that time was a systematic effort for the prefectural government, particularly Fukushima Kencho in particular, as well as the Japanese central government, tried to minimize the amount of radiation. And then, as you mentioned, mysteriously one day, Prime Minister Khan declared that you can't get in. So they finally, I think, there's enough. The complaint went into it. But my question, not a question, really, what surprised me was Japan was known for the most strict radiation safety laws. This is a pre-accident in terms of radiation handling in a hospital or a research institute. It's very, very strict compared to the U.S., for instance. But right after, after the nuclear accident, basically become totally lawless. And these facts are example. And the Fukushima station, west side, I brought my Geiger counter, and basically needle is off the scale. And so I pointed out these things to Fukushima Minpo. I met editors there. And what surprised me was they don't want to hear those things. And their primary concern is the losing a community. And for Fukushima Minpo, it was a losing business. For Fukushima Kencho, prefecture government, losing a people means less revenue, less positions. And so and also there's a blatant concealment of speedy data, when initial prediction of where the
Yeah,
so
we covered that.
That's right.
In fact, a while
I'm
ago.
sorry I came late.
In the book, we wrote about it quite a bit.
My question is, it really surprises me that Japan, sometimes Japanese media or public opinion is very, very strict about food safety or some other things. And they really, generally stick to high standard. But once something like this happens, almost, anything goes, or pretty much anything goes, and they become, even to this day, it's a whole taboo to raise this issue. So how do you, I'm having a hard time reconciling this as a Japanese, Japanese-born person who lived in abroad for a long time. And how, why do you think this happened?
Confusion. Basically, there was, in terms of food safety, that still is a huge issue. There was actually no overall governmental system that was set up to test the foods. So the food safety, the food testing became a very local situation, and to this day it still is. So that was one of the biggest problems that we came across, that we couldn't believe that there wasn't actually some agreed upon system of testing food.
I guess my question is, Japan banned the import of the U.S. beef because of a BSC, or for years, maybe 10 years, or for a long time. So on one hand, they can go very strict, but if something happened, even though you can go to Fukushima now, and if it's a Geiger counter, it's radioactive all over the place, and just things, and then people walking as though nothing happened.
Well, I haven't thought about it, but just off the top of my head, maybe it's because it's the same process. It's a bureaucratic process that does both. It's the bureaucratic process that says you can't import meat from Britain because it's all infected or it's all BSE or whatever it is. And then it's the same bureaucratic process that declares radiation levels are safe at whatever level in schools. So if you recall, Munkasho, the Ministry of Education, overnight, just with the cross of a pen, raised the acceptable level of radiation in schoolyards from 1 to 20 millisieverts a year. Sorry, I was mixed up on microsieverts. Yeah, okay, good as somebody knows what he's talking about here. But I remember they multiplied it by 20 times. I remember the shock that people felt, they said, well, how can they do that? 20, they multiplied by 5 or something. And it was an emergency, and that was their excuse. When you talk to the next people, they would say, well, we have to because this is an emergency situation and we will ensure the safety of children. They'll stay indoors, they'll lock their windows and all the rest of it. But it was just very striking the way the bureaucracy was able to declare that, and everybody had to kind of fall into line. And I remember talking to people in Fukushima City and talking to school teachers, and they said, The moment they felt that there was a real problem was when Munkesho declared there isn't a problem. You know, when Munkesho sent the message down the line kind of thing, it's okay, it's safe, that's when they started saying, shit, it's not safe, you know. And it's that kind of idea of, there's a message which is relayed from the bureaucracy to everybody else, that everybody sort of has to follow the line. I don't know, that's a partial answer, but that's my best guess of what's going on there. Maybe somebody else can comment.
Well, I can't comment on that, but I have a couple of questions for you. One is, as journalists, were you surprised about the outcome of the elections, the low voter turnout and the outcome, and the relative weakness of the third parties that had prior to the elections expected to have a much stronger showing? The second question is, how did you come up with the title for your book?
Well, yeah, I was surprised. I think everybody was a little bit surprised. Although, you know, as we wrote for The Economist, there's a lot of qualifiers. First of all, 11 million people didn't bother to vote at all. They stayed at home. And it seems as though they were young people. You know, the way that the voting system, the average voting age here is like 56, something like that. So the young people stay at home and the old people vote. And of course, not only was the turnout low, but the vote overall for the LDP comparatively was quite low. You know, it was like, I think 20% or something like that. I forget exactly. So, you know, I think that's part of the answer. But the complete collapse of the anti-nuclear vote, I don't understand. I don't pretend to understand that. You know, it's very striking. I understand why people didn't vote for the DPJ, because the DPJ by last December was a completely different party to the DPJ that was elected in 2009. It just, you know, it bore no resemblance. So people refused to vote for them again. I can understand that, and perhaps they were punishing perhaps this is just a question. They were punishing the DPJ for kowtowing, what was seen under NODA as kowtowing to the nuclear village. I mean, people forget that Khan did say when he was in power that he had switched to the anti-nuclear position, and then NODA comes into power, and he basically, you know, fudges it, but people are left with the impression that he wants the nuclear reactor switched back on. But why? You know, obviously the anti-nuclear vote was divided. That's pretty clear. They were divided between all these parties. And that didn't help their cause. But why exactly people voted, even with all the qualifiers I've just said, voted for the LDP to come back to power, I don't know. Somebody else should answer that. It's just another example of why Japan is different. You know, it really is. I mean, it just strikes you sometimes. It's a very unusual place. I mean, you know, you're right. I mean, after a nuclear disaster that size, for people to vote a party they know is pro-nuclear back into power, despite the fact that it's Abe, and we know about him, and all the other problems with the LDP. You know, it's a very surprising thing. As for the title of the book, that comes from a Kenji Miyazawa poem, Ame ni Momakazu, which is Strong in the Rain. He, of course, was from Tohoku. And we kept hearing that poem over and over again when we were researching the book. It became the kind of emblematic poem of the disaster. Watanabe Ken read the poem, and I think you can find it on YouTube as a message to the people of Tohoku. Now the message is pretty clear, right? You know, be strong, you'll get over this. And then also it was the favorite poem of Mayor Sakurai. So we kept hearing that and we thought, well, that's our title, you know, that's perfect. Because we wanted not just to talk about the disaster, we also wanted to make it a positive book. You know, it's about overcoming disaster. It's about looking forward, and the title seemed perfect for that.
I just have to go back to the food thing, because in the beginning you were asking if someone was still afraid, and unfortunately I don't speak Japanese, so it's difficult for me to get information. But I have 3 kids, and I come from Sweden, and I live when the Chernobyl accident happened, and it came quite a lot of radiation to Sweden in a particular area. And the testing of the food was really rigorous. They tested a lot, And when I was here, I couldn't get that feeling that there is a system for how to test, and you know that it makes it more hard to believe that the food is safe. And is there a system that you can see that you could?
No,
You know.
there's not. As I said, it's still being done pretty much on the local level. There have been, but for instance, in Rikuzen Takata, Sesko's son is a farmer, and he's been doing rigorous testing, and everything's clean, everything's fine. And so apparently there's a lot more confidence about the food in that area. You mentioned the rice. They have I guess last year's rice crop has still some radiation in it, but they're hoping that next year will be okay. So there is a lot of work being done on that. But food like mushrooms are still, you shouldn't eat them, and certain other foods as well. So.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering if I didn't go to Helen Caldicott's lectures. I'm wondering if either of you attended any of them, and if you might offer your impressions of them.
Well, I didn't go, but I know what she's going to say.
Yes.
She's all over YouTube, and her message is quite famous, you know. In fact, has she been? She's been here, has she? I didn't even know she'd come.
She was here, I don't know how, within the last 3 months, I think, and
Right.
she left saying the situation is very sad. I'm a little
Right.
disturbed. You know, I'm very anti-nuclear, but I'm a little disturbed
Right.
by her comments. And I do understand that her mode is her mode, and that's
Yeah.
how she gets her message across. But I
Yeah.
would be interested to hear your responses, people in the media, and
Right.
with this kind of book out.
Oh, sorry. Well, for those people who don't know who Helen Callicott is, she's an Australian. She's a physician. She is very anti-nuclear. And straight after the disaster, I can't remember how quickly after, but maybe like a week or two, she was on TV saying that the Fukushima disaster was much worse than Chernobyl and would result in 1 million deaths or more. You know, as I said the other night, there's a few of those. Arnie Gunderson is another. He's an American, and he actually doesn't like to be described as an anti-nuclear activist. He says he's a former nuclear engineer, and he was over, and I did interview him, and he said 1 million people would die from elevated cancers. And there's been Chris Busby, of course, from Britain, who also came, and you know he famously brought a change of clothes. So he went to Fukushima and talked about, you know, shards of radiation poisoning everybody, and then he came back to Narita and he changed his clothes before he went back to the UK because he was so paranoid about what he got on his clothes. Now, Busby's been kind of discredited because it seems as though he's selling products he's associated with a company selling anti-nuclear products. So we don't have to worry about him. But Helen Callicott, I mean, I respect her, you know, but whenever I hear the figure of 1 million deaths, the first thing I said to Arnie Gunderson was, well, where did you get that? And his explanation for where he got it wasn't very convincing, you know. He said that there were, after 3 Mile Island, there was research which showed 10,000 extra cancer deaths, I think it was from lung cancer, from xenon gases and other gases that had escaped from the power plants in which had gone downriver. You can check that out yourself. And he said, the big untold story of Fukushima is the gases that escaped. Everybody's talking about cesium, right? Cesium and being the main one, but not the only one. But they don't talk about the gases, and the gases are going to kill people, right? And then from that 10,000 deaths, by one researcher, he extrapolated to 1 million deaths in Fukushima. And, you know, I'm as paranoid as anybody about radiation, but that just didn't seem very scientific to me, in the sense that, you know, that's an outlier, that would not be considered consensual research, right? It would be considered an outlier account of what happened. And then from that he extrapolated and multiplied by X amounts to get Fukushima. So I don't want to diss the man, you know, I'm sure he's a serious scientist and all the rest of it. But we're in a situation where there's no consensus at all about how dangerous it is. And that's, to me, what we sort of wanted to focus on in the book. Not, you know, how many people are going to die, just about how insidious the worries are. You know, you can never really tell for certain how many people are going to die, if any, from this disaster, from radiation. And, you know, the biggest, if you probably know this, but there's two big banner research projects associated with Chernobyl, one of which says roughly 4,000 extra deaths, and the other of which says close to 1 million, the New York Academy of Science report. And then Greenpeace sort of falls in sort of the 200,000 level, right? So that's what sort of makes it so terrifying in a way, is there's no consensus and everybody has their own figure. And I think you're right, you know, it's very unhelpful when people come over and say, yeah, 1 million people, you know, like as almost as though they plucked the figure out of the air, you know. It doesn't actually help that much, I don't think.
Sir, you're next.
Yes, just a quick question. Earlier in the discussion, you mentioned that a lot of the people in the disaster area, there was pressure to stay. A lot of them wanted to stay and did stay in the area. I'm wondering, just physically, how did they? The houses had been swept away, food and water weren't coming in. How were they able to stay in the area with all the damage?
Evacuation centers.
And so
Yeah.
by stay, you mean in the shelters?
Yes,
Then?
yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I have a question. My name is Tatsuya, I'm a medical doctor. I was around on Saturday when an earthquake hit the Tokyo area. Anyway, and after the earthquake, there was some no enter zone. Not only Fukushima area, but also around earthquake hit area. And my question is, when I went to the bookshop, because I wanted to buy Time magazine, published immediately after the earthquake, but there was no Time. There were no Time magazines at the bookshops, and in Japan, we cannot watch and say disaster hit area, by probably not TV and not YouTube. So my question is there any are there any press restraints, or were you able to enter everywhere in Tokyo area?
In the beginning, yeah.
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 No, there were none. No, I mean you could go. I've never been stopped, or I was never stopped until April. I mean, you weren't supposed to go because it was dangerous.
Oh.
And the cops would drive around in their full body masks, and they would say, "Abonitis, yo," they would say that like, but they wouldn't arrest you. Now they can arrest you. No, there was nothing like that. The only restriction was that I can recall was that it was very hard to get access to officials. You could go to the press conferences, the TEPCO press conferences, the NISA press conferences, and you get overwhelmed with this information. With nobody, it was just like, what are they talking about, And there was no one to make sense of it, and it was very hard. What we wanted to do was go directly to Edano, for example, speak directly to Edano or speak directly to Cannes, but you couldn't. They were blocked. They, I don't know if they were blocked only to us foreign reporters, but they were probably blocked to everybody actually. But I don't recall. That's not. No, you see, I don't think that's the way the news management worked. It wasn't blocking you from going places. I mean, the most distinctive part of news management to me at the time was the way that anybody who was critical of nuclear power was shut off from the TV. So there's been studies since. There's a very good one by Professor Ito at Todai. I forget his first name, but you'll find it. I think it's in the book as well. But he looked at all the TV coverage of the disaster in the first week after the March 11th, and he found that a single anti-nuclear voice was on TV. It was on Fuji Terabi on the night of the disaster, and And that was it. And this guy said, there's a possibility, I'm really worried there's going to be a meltdown. That was on March 11th. And then he was never invited back. And the people who were on TV all the time, especially on NHK, tended to be pro-nuclear, and they tended to say, it's fine, relax, don't worry. And I interviewed a couple of those, one professor in particular, who was sort of on the TV so much, he probably was camping in the studio, and his message was the same. It's fine, you know, relax. The disaster is under control, trust the officials. I think that's the way the news management worked. You know, it was the exclusion of anti-nuclear, it was the exclusion of people who might push the panic button, and the overwhelming approach of people who are so pro-nuclear. Yomiuri. Lucy wants me to mention Yomiuri. Don't imagine why. Why would I have to mention Yomiuri? Well, they weren't very keen to report the anti-nuclear cause. Let's put it that way. Yeah. In fact, there's another study of the news coverage of the protests all the way up to last July, and it's quite striking that somebody has measured all the column inches given to the anti-nuclear cause, and of course the Yomiuri is, you know, a very small amount. Tokyo Shimbun is the best, apparently.
I would like to make one comment and then ask you a second question. You mentioned sometimes the Japanese bureaucracy. I think this is a big problem, but I think the much more bigger problem is the Japanese nuclear power village. So the connection between nuclear power companies, politicians and bureaucracy, and the Japanese media, especially newspapers, and I think NHK too. So, and this triangle was very successful. It was successful in the December election, and I think this village will be successful in the future too. So far we have only 2 nuclear power plants still working in Japan, but I think in the next, I don't know, 12 months, there will be much more than the only 2 power plants working in Japan. So, this is my comment to this topic, and then I have a question. What do you think about the future of Tohoku? Has this area future?
Well, it's interesting. If you go up to Sendai, you'll see that there's a building boom going on right now. Sendai, yeah. And so the first phase was cleanup, and now the second phase is rebuilding. Again, Rikuzen Takata is another example. They are rebuilding homes.
Are they rebuilding the same places?
No. In Rikuzen Takata, it's an interesting example, actually. They've, Mayor Toba, I'm sure you've read about him, they've closed the area that's near the ocean. They're going to turn it into a park. Another one of the big building projects is the seawalls. So they're building that seawall right now, and much higher than it was before, of course. And they are going to be building a hotel to house the workers who are coming up to do all the building. So there is actually some activity happening on that end.
But the future of Tohoku is just really hard to predict, you know. I mean, we say in the book that the disaster came at a really striking time in Japan, because you have your population has peaked, and you have a hugely indebted state with falling tax revenues, and also you have those communities which are depopulating and aging. Before all of this happened, a lot of those communities, especially the coastal communities. So you would just wonder, where's the money going to come from? I mean, it's really striking how the cleanup has been really quick, you know. I mean, everybody was struck by that. You drove up there and all the garbage had been piled up, the gareki had been piled up in nice little piles in like really amazingly short time, you know. And the highways had all been repaired, and it was just incredible how fast they repaired the highways. But I haven't been up there in months. I was up in Sendai last week, and there is a building boom going on up there, of course, but that's Sendai. But it was striking last time I was up in Tohoku that there was no real rebuilding going on in the communities. And there's lots of reasons for that, you know. Actually, I've just been reading Phil Brazzer's piece. I don't know if anybody knows Phil Brazzer at the Japan Times, but he's a terrific journalist. But he said that there's sort of 19 trillion yen budgeted for the recovery of the area between now and 2015. But a lot of the money isn't going to the area. It's been siphoned off by bureaucracies. And he quotes some of the examples. The Ministry of Justice, for example, received 28 million yen for vocation training of prison inmates in Hokkaido and Saitama.
But those have been stopped, haven't they?
Have they?
Yeah.
Since then, okay. But I think it's indicative of the way that a lot of the money that was supposed to go to Tohoku was siphoned off for other things. And I think that's part of the reason why the rebuilding is not going to Tohoku.
I know, we don't really have all that much more time, but I know there are a whole bunch of students here from the British School. Are you guys on the back there? As the future generation, it would be great to hear some questions from you guys, if you don't mind. So be brave, be brave. It's always good to hear questions from young people. Oh, come on. One person, please. Come on.
You have to do what you do in class, you have to think something.
Yeah. Oh, come on, you guys. Are you scared? Yeah, okay, that's a good question. Are you guys scared about radiation? Who's, of you guys all from the British School, who's scared about radiation? Anybody? Raise your hand if you are. Just one. Oh, all right. Okay.
No, I saw two.
Two. And how come you're not scared about radiation? How come you're not scared about radiation? Okay, whoever asks a question is going to get a free book. Okay? All right, come on. 1, 2, 3. Raise your hand. All right, there you go. All right.
I'm not really a student, but I'll ask a question anyway.
Why are you getting a book anyway?
When you were interviewing the Japanese people, did you ever find that they were a bit hesitant to talk to you because you were foreigners? Because I noticed like sometimes as a foreigner, Japanese people would be a bit reserved when talking to you, so I wondered if you ever came across that problem.
No, I found the opposite. They were so happy to speak to a non-Japanese, and the emotion, everything just started flooding out. What's going on, my life, you know, the whole thing. And it was almost overwhelming, in fact. Yeah, it was kind of a therapy for them, in a way.
Yeah, that's, I would say, the opposite. People really wanted to talk to you. And they, it helps as well that the stuff is going to print in a foreign newspaper in English, you know. Their neighbors don't have to read it, or... You know, actually, a lot of the time people would say to you, is this going to appear in Japan? And you'd say no, and they go, okay. And then they talk to you. So, no, it wasn't a problem at all.
In fact, it was more of an advantage, in a way, of being non-Japanese and reporting on this whole thing. Because people were very honest.
I was going to mention something about the nuclear, the anti-nuke guy. Only one anti-nuclear item was in the Japanese newspapers. Whether it's herd mentality, the reporters, whatever, I'm not sure. I live in Washington, D.C., and I was back there about a week after the disaster, and George Washington University, which is a fairly prestigious place, was holding a seminar on the disaster and its impacts, and I'm a disaster researcher snatched by a renter. And there were 3 people. The one I can't remember, but the nuclear fella did explain that everything was fine. He was an American. Everything was fine in Fukushima. That basically it was kind of like going out on a sunny day, you know, without your sunscreen. And the expert on disasters said that Japan has a great disaster response system, which they really don't. So I don't know if it's a conspiracy or the herd mentality of people, but there seems to be a thing that once an idea gets out there, oh, everything's really fine or whatever, people just go along with it.
Well, is that still the case? When was this seminar? When was it?
The seminar was at George Washington University. It was like maybe a week or 2 after March 11th.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe the opinions are very different at this point.
I sure hope so.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, GW is my alma mater, actually. So I certainly hope the opinion has changed.
You said that you wanted to write a positive book, and I've read the book and I really liked it. But it's coming up to 2 years after the disaster, and I just wonder what is positive about it. You know, we all kind of thought that, you know, like Mayor Sakurai, something good would come out of this. And Japan does have a history of reacting to disaster in interesting and dynamic ways. But I don't see it. I'm just wondering, especially you, I mean, it's so difficult with nuclear. I mean, this is a nuclear disaster. There's nothing positive about a nuclear disaster. But I mean, you really focused on the tsunami areas, and you've talked about Sentakata, but do you see anything that really makes you feel, yes, we're turning around here, or Japan is, you know, has, or not necessarily Japan, but some people, some communities have responded well?
That is a really good question, and it's a really tough question to answer. I'm really trying not to be cynical about it, but it's very, very easy to be. Some of the most positive, interesting people who are feeling very up about Japan are scientists. And I ended up actually interviewing quite a few scientists about the quake and about the tsunami. And there's a lot of research, a lot was learned about the whole process, about the whole scientific side of it, which has been huge actually worldwide. And this movie, The Impossible, that's just come out, the 2004 tsunami in Thailand, that's a very, very popular movie and up for Academy Awards. And so the whole tsunami issues are really now in the limelight. And there is a lot happening on that. But in terms of the people who are living in the area, yeah, they're just trying to rebuild their lives. Like Setsuko, actually, her case is kind of interesting because she still misses her husband terribly, but her son has come back to live with her and ended up bringing back his partner, who had 2 boys, a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old. And so her home went from this very sad house of mourning to this very lively, kid-friendly, noisy place. And so she's rebuilding her life. She's building a new house. The community is still there. She gets together with her friends all the time. And so she's sort of a positive case, but yeah, there's a lot of people having a really hard time. Yeah.
Well, I don't know what to say. You know, I mean, I think probably when we go back up there, I mean, we're going to go back up there, I guess, to report next month, and then we'll have a better idea of, you know, whether there's anything to be positive about. But I mean, one of the things we wanted to capture was maybe not the short-term physical things, but the long-term bonds, I suppose, that hold people together. And one of the anecdotes we weren't really able to put in the book, which I wanted to, was you would go around, you probably saw the same thing, but you would go around these refugee centres, you know, in makeshift gymnasiums and community halls, and you would see that people had divided their little cardboard houses into the same communities that they used to live in. They had little labels for the neighborhood where they used to live, you know, and each of those. So they basically replicated their old communities inside of these community halls, community centers, and they had immediately sort of developed a system for helping the poor, helping the weakest members of the community, without really being told. I mean, I don't think anybody, you know, nobody from the top said, do this, do that, do the other thing. And all that kind of fell into place as a way of surviving the sort of initial first few weeks. And I thought that was really positive, you know. I just couldn't imagine something like that happening where I come from, you know. I just think it would be chaos, right? So the idea that that those communities would endure a lot more than communities elsewhere, enduring the unendurable, to paraphrase somebody, was quite positive to me. I came away from that thinking, well, I mean, they can put up with a lot, you know, a lot. And a lot has happened. I mean, you know, Futaba, for example, all those people now are scattered everywhere. Who knows if they'll ever get back to where they were. But that sense of, you know, community, of collectiveness and so on was quite positive to me.
So one of the questions I had for you was, why do you think individual stories like this are so compelling? Like, what is it about telling the story of the everyday person that is so interesting for readers?
It's so real, and you can relate to it, relate to them so easily. And it's the best way, I think, to address a very huge topic in a small way, but it gives a really big picture. I think it's easy for people to capture the essence of the story that way.
Yeah, I think it's just the best way of telling something like this. You know, how are you supposed to understand it until you? How are you supposed to understand a nuclear disaster until you hear how it affects ordinary people like me and you? What would we do? What did they do? You know, and comparing our stories. And it's a well-tried method as well. You know, we were talking about the John Hershey book, or the Hershey book on Hiroshima, which did the same thing, right? So how do you capture the magnitude of something like Hiroshima? Well, you go to ordinary people and you say, well, how did it affect you? And it doesn't preclude you from drawing the big picture, you know, as well. But it is ultimately the only way, I think, to tell something like that, the impact on ordinary people.
Hi, I'm from the British School.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you interviewed any other people before deciding on these 6.
Oh, right.
series.
Yeah, we did. It was really hard, actually, to decide on the 6 people. David mentioned 2 of the people, the Chinese fish factory worker and the photographer. And one of the things is there's 5 men and only 1 woman, and that was not done on purpose. I was really trying to find a woman, at least one more, who could we could work within that, but it just ended up the way it did for.
There aren't very many women fishing like that.
Yeah, not many women who are fishermen, exactly.
Women
nuclear workers, yeah. So unfortunately, only 1 woman. But there were so many stories that we wanted. We could write, you know, a whole nother book about all the people that we interviewed and that we met. It was hard choosing 6. Okay. Oh, do you want to finish? It's 9 o'clock. Oh, it's after 9.
Thank you.
You can
Thanks very much to Lucy.
ask us afterwards.
Okay. Yeah.
And the book is for sale, it's 3,000 yen. I hope you'll take advantage of the opportunity to get it. We have events sometimes 3-4 times a month. I think we did 47 public lectures last year. So it would be great if you could leave your meishi so we can put you on the mailing list. You'll note next to the book sale area there's a little donation box. You know, we're a non-profit institution, yet these things do cost something. So if you are feeling generous and have a little change left over after you bought the book, maybe you could donate. Thanks for coming on.